What's up, everybody? Welcome to the most recent installment of Nuclear Barbarians. It is I, Emmett, your nuclear barbarian, and I am here with the climate scientist, Roger Pielke Jr., and we're going to talk about climate science and climate science. And he's written some very fascinating stuff in his Substack, The Honest Broker. Check it out in the show notes, subscribe, get a paying subscription. Come on now. And we're going to have some fun today. So how you doing, man? Thanks for coming on.
Pleasure to be here. Happy to be chatting with you. Finally get to see you face to face. So
Yeah, absolutely. So before we get going here and sort of delving into some of this stuff, which I found really just, as somebody who covers a lot of environmental history, because I think that the history of the environmental movement is usually treated as like a hagiography, and it's
right.
rarely critical, and there's very little in the genealogy of ideas and how they turn it flower into policy. So I was glad that you did that. But before we get into that, how did you become a climate scientist? Was that something you always wanted? Basically, how did you become the Roger Pielke Jr.?
Yeah, well, I mean, my background, my schooling is in math and political science. So I don't usually call myself a climate scientist because I sit at that messy intersection where science and policy and politics collide. My research, though, if you look at it, I publish in climate science journals, climate policy journals. And so I'm kind of a weird interdisciplinary scholar. But it all started with Roger Pielke Sr., who's my dad, who actually is a world famous, now retired climate scientist. And I got a math degree as an undergrad. I thought I was going to be a physical scientist like my dad. Long story short, had a chance to go work on the Hill at the House Science Committee, and got to see that science and politics colliding is a pretty fascinating place. Wound up doing a PhD on how climate science can be useful in policy, and this was in the early '90s before climate science was really a thing.
That's like right after Rio. That is like right when that enters the discourse. I was doing some combing through the DOE archives into some of Ken Lay's speeches from Enron, and he was he was at the tip of the spear for some of that stuff.
Yeah, that was a time when George Bush Sr. was saying things like he was going to counter the greenhouse effect with the White House effect.
That's right.
Climate hadn't become so deeply partisan at the time. I had done my master's thesis on the space shuttle program, evaluating whether it was a success or a failure. And then I wanted to do a more complicated policy evaluation. And I don't know, somewhere along the way, in 1991, the U.S. Goal Change Research Act passed. And I said, all right, this looks complicated. I'm going to evaluate how we know if that's working or not. So, I did a postdoc at NCAR, National Center for Atmospheric Research, focused on extreme weather. So I've been working literally on extreme weather for like 30 years. I was there for 8 years. Then I wound up going to the University of Colorado Boulder, starting the Science Policy Center, and got investigated by Congress, got attacked by the White House science advisor, was in the WikiLeaks, was in the ClimateGate email. So it's been kind of an interesting journey, but I've had a front row seat to the whole climate science and policy issue for about 30 years.
Yeah. Wow. What a fascinating trajectory. So real quick, what I remember, because as I was telling you before we started recording, like when working on Michael Schellenberger's Apocalypse Never, I was tasked with going through the WikiLeaks stuff. My understanding of it was basically, and this is sort of contextualize your perspective and what I think is unique about it. Obviously you take climate change seriously. It's real. It's something that's unfolding, right? But there were claims being made about extreme weather impacts getting more and more dangerous. And you demonstrated empirically that this claim didn't stand up to scrutiny. And in fact, the opposite was true. And that got you on the wrong side of the discourse, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And, I tend not to talk about extreme weather events like in a big bucket, because I mean, the reality is nuanced, and the real world doesn't like
it's always complicated. Like some things may not be, some things are.
Yeah, exactly.
I think the ones that they were talking about, you'd specified it, maybe it was hurricanes.
Yeah.
And you'd said coastal damage just isn't what it used to be.
Right. I mean, one of the things, this is, this for me, it's kind of interesting to look back, is I started a postdoc in 1994 focused on
Mhm.
hurricanes. And one of the first big impact papers I did was with a scientist named Chris Lancy, who's now at the National Hurricane Center, where we asked the question, if there was a period in the 1990s that was the most inactive period for hurricanes in the last 50 years, but it was also the most expensive in terms of damage.
Mm.
And we said, all right, you can't use damage to say anything about activity. And the obvious elephant in the room is, oh, we're building more condos and high rises and structures and people and vacation homes and beach houses. And that's leading to the damage. So by the time Al Gore's movie came out in 2006, I had been working on hurricanes for more than a decade, and whatever reasons that Al Gore had for focusing his movie on Katrina, which was 2005 and a massive tragedy, but it was the centerpiece of that movie. Hurricanes became kind of a center talking point in the climate debate, and I had already published extensively on that topic. I was getting awards for my research showing that it was societal change, not climate change. But
Mm.
once that movie came out, for me, it really changed the landscape of how the issue was discussed.
Yeah, it really did. I was actually writing on this. I'm putting together a book proposal, and I have to do the horrific part of it where I explain why I'm the guy that's supposed to write it,
Right,
which means I have to write about myself, which feels like removing one of my own organs.
right.
Um,
Been there, done that. Yeah, I
yeah,
hear you.
yeah, exactly. And so I had to go back I was like, well, when did I go back? Like, what would be the origin story for this? And it was sitting in St. Ignatius College Prep in
Yep.
Chicago and watching An Inconvenient Truth
Interesting. Yeah.
and having Al Gore, like in his sort of plodding and patient way, give the first PowerPoint presentation I'd ever seen in my entire life,
Yeah.
and it did like that seems to already environmentalism was becoming a paradigm through which we viewed energy.
Right.
And then climate, I think, became the entrenchment
Yeah.
of that paradigm, which is a fascinating time. This is the time at the same time, just to put this in more context for people, that Hurricane Katrina is interesting because Enron traders who'd gone into other hedge funds had bet
Right.
on natural gas futures around the time and bid up the price, and that allowed Aubrey McClendon to drill worn out wells for good money, and it led to the gas boom. And that didn't solve anything, but all of this stuff is happening
Yeah.
around the
Wow.
same time. And so is this narrative that I grew up with as the thing that we have to avoid, which is 1.5 Celsius,
Yeah.
right? Warming of 1.5 Celsius. So that's my back in to
Yep.
the first piece of yours I wanted to talk about. Where did this actually come from? This phrase. First of all, what is it? What do people mean when they say 1.5 C? And then we'll get to where it comes from.
Yeah, that's a great question because there's a lot of confusion about
Yeah.
this. Measuring the global average surface temperature. It's not like, I have a thermometer out my window and I can tell you what it is.
You don't just lick
Um,
it, like,
right?
breathe on it and stick it out. And
My
you're like,
finger out.
ah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And there's some peer-reviewed papers actually discussing and debating, what is the global average surface temperature and what does it mean? And if it's a long average, so climate, we have to go back to what climate is. Climate is the statistics of weather and weather phenomena over a period of decades and longer. The canonical time by the World Meteorological Organization is 30 years, but climate obviously operates on shorter and longer timescales, but it's a long time. So in order to identify a global average surface temperature at any point in time, you need to know what happens in the future. So in reality, it might be 10 years after we hit a certain temperature threshold that we know that we hit it. It's
Yes.
not the instantaneous temperature. So in the media lately, there's been some discussions that, well, if there's an El Nino event, which is a warming of the Central Pacific, that may push global temperatures in the next couple of years over 1.5 degrees. That's a different thing than the metric that's used to evaluate climate change. And so it gets real complicated real fast. But the reality, and we can get into this, is that it's 1.5 or 2 degrees. They're nice round numbers. They're more signifiers than hard and fast thresholds. And so, it's always difficult in policy because when, there's an old saying in policy, It has, you know, a lot of people who are claimed to have said it, but when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a useful measure anymore, because that's what
Mm,
everybody focuses on. So so yeah, it's and we can talk about, you know, the genesis and the history of ideas, which is always fascinating in policy. But the important thing for people to remember is that it's a qualitative concept expressed quantitatively.
mhm.
And we can get into what that actually means, but there's nothing magical about 1.5 versus 1.56732 or 1.8 or 1.4. It's a signifier.
Well, see, this is sort of what's interesting to me, right? I've been rereading this one paragraph Borges story like all year, and it's his map versus territory one
Yeah,
about
yeah.
the cartographers who try to create the map
Yep.
that befits the whole empire. And of course, and the story is called On Exactitude in Science, right?
Yeah, yep, yep.
And it's a fake historical document. It's
Right,
one paragraph long. And I keep returning to it because when it comes to energy or climate, it seems like signifiers and models tend to win out over the physical and the empirical, in a way that's very, very frustrating, because it's not as if we live in a world where models and signifiers aren't important.
right.
But how that gets weighted, I think, is very, very difficult, not just in a partisan environment, but I actually think that there's a deeper problem that we also live in an incredibly mediated social environment that
Right,
is rife with signifiers and assumed meanings.
right.
So
Yeah,
those
I mean,
disaggregations get even harder.
yeah, I mean, it's interesting you raise that analogy, because in my policy courses, so I taught a lot, kind of just general policy analysis. I explained to my students that what we do in policy analysis is we create maps of the world. You know, the world's complicated. It's super complicated. We can never fully understand it or appreciate it or catalog it. But in order to move our way through the world, we need maps of the context that we're in, so that we can intentionally go from where we're at today to where we want to be, you know,
Mhm.
whatever that policy goal happens to be. So all that we do in policy analysis are try to create useful and to some degree accurate maps of the world we're going through, so that we can have intentional decisions taking us to where we want to be. If we can't anticipate where we're going to be in the future, then, you know, let's give it up. We don't need policy analysis, and it's all just random. I don't believe that. I think, you
Right,
know,
right, right.
in the history, you know, of energy, of agriculture, of health, shows that, yeah, we can do a pretty good job intentionally moving towards a goal. Might take a long time,
Mhm.
but I think climate is very similar. But that puts a lot of attention on, well, how do we construct these maps that we then use to move through the world? And on climate, I think there's, you know, some good empirical evidence that the dominant maps, paradigms for how we think about the issue, sometimes lead us astray.
Yeah, and I think the story of 1.5C is a really good version
Yep.
of that, right? So the way that you have it is there's a correspondence between Bill McKibben and James Hansen. And Bill McKibben's like, all right, man, give me the parts per million number. What's going on? And James Hansen says, I have this unpublished draft, and I think it's like 350 parts per million, correlated to, 1.5C warming. And Bill McKibben says, great, I'm going to name my organization that, and we're going to take out an ad in the
Yep.
Financial Times before the big 2009 sort of disastrous climate meeting that doesn't really go
Right. Right. Right.
anywhere. And it becomes like ad copy in the name of his organization. And then somehow it becomes policy. So how does it go from that stage, from advertising in a way,
Yep.
to policy, and even in a strange way to become adopted by the scientific community, perhaps against their better judgment?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's a great summary in a nutshell. And let me rewind the tape a little bit
Please,
and
please.
and go it earlier. Um, in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, it was the first big international um, convention on climate change, and the language that was agreed upon there was that we wanted to avoid what was called, this is a direct quote, dangerous anthropogenic interference
Mm,
in the climate system. recognizing that there's going to be economic costs and that countries have different responsibilities. But that phrase, dangerous anthropogenic interference, it's kind of like an ink blot, right? It wasn't defined. What did it mean? So really for, more than a decade, there was a big debate in the literature over what does that mean? How do we operationalize that in policy? And there's a number of different metrics. And one key factor behind all of these is that the lens through which climate policy has been implemented has largely been models. There are what are called integrated assessment models, which integrate society, energy, the economy. And then there's physical climate models. And it was very easy to take a model and say, all right, we want to optimize climate policy based on what the model tells us. And early on, as you mentioned, there were what we call concentration targets. So this is a measure of how much carbon dioxide is accumulating in the atmosphere. So when we burn fossil fuels, that emits carbon dioxide, and it's not forever, but from a policy standpoint, it might be forever. It stays in the atmosphere for a long time.
Yeah.
Right. It's like if you put water in a bathtub, you're filling it up. It'll evaporate eventually, but as far as your floor and rug is concerned, it's in there, forever. It's not going to evaporate before you
right.
And so early on, there was a focus on concentration targets, and the targets, again, nice round numbers that were talked about. Early on, it was a doubling of pre-industrial carbon dioxide, so from 280 parts per million to 560. That eventually was winnowed down to a target of 450 parts per million, which, as you mentioned, corresponds to a roughly 2-degree temperature increase over pre-industrial. And so Bill McKibben and James Hansen had their discussion 2007, 2008, somewhere around there, right about when the policy community was shifting from talking about concentration targets, which, people listening to this are probably already eyes rolling back in their head. Try to explain that to the general public or, on the floor of Congress, to temperature targets, which the idea was, well, this is a much more
way easier for me to understand, especially because back then, this was fascinating, right? Like back then, if you were liberal, you called it global warming.
Right.
And if you were conservative, you called it climate change.
Yeah. Yeah, which is interesting because, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, uses the phrase climate change and predates all of that partisan U.S. discussion.
Right, which is another strange wrinkle. Like, I'm not saying,
right.
I'm only pointing out that this is the wrinkles that go into how this happens are actually really important to pay attention to.
Absolutely.
Because you can see even unintentional sleights of hand get rhetorically built into these models and how we talk about these policies.
Right. Yeah. So back then there was a kind of a parallel track, and, it involves an advisory committee to the German government, Angela Merkel and others, thinking that, well, 2 degrees is a much more apprehensible, understandable concept. The concept of 2 degrees has its own intellectual history. The economist, Nobel Prize winner, William Nordhaus, discussed, a 2-degree temperature change in a 1977 paper, based on the idea that the Central England temperature record over, 500 years only fluctuated plus or minus 1 degree. So he said, it seems like that's where humanity can thrive. There was never, one thing to understand about these targets is they're not hard and fast. They're more, they're more like what ifs, or, let's just set a hard boundary. Economists use the term stylized, and they're kind of stylized policy.
Oh, good. I'm glad you brought that up, because I was about to ask you. I was like, I hadn't heard that phrase before. So
stylized refers
stylized,
to like for purposes of assumption, let's assume that the U.S. has a population of 350 million in 2030.
Yeah.
Right. And then, all right, so we made that assumption. Now we can do some analysis with that. But that's not me saying I predict that
No, you're getting wind in the sail to see if you can generate helpful information, right? Like that's what's happening. Like you have, this is something that, I have taught Euclidean geometry before, like
Yeah.
from Euclid's Elements. And
Yep.
the first thing we always talk about are the definitions. And the
Right.
first one, a point. A point is that which has no part.
Right.
And I'm like, what the hell could this even mean? And why do we start
Right.
here? And it's because,
Right.
first of all, you have to start somewhere. So you
Right.
start with the smallest thing.
Yeah.
And it's similar with this stuff. It's like, we're not going to say it's going to be like a bajillion, like
Right.
two seems reasonable. Like it
Right.
seems like, it seems like we could wrap our heads around that. And then
Right.
what
Right.
comes
Right.
out of that? And is it useful? And is it like perspicacious? All of these things.
Right. Right. Yeah. And so when McKibben and Hansen had their conversation, Hansen had his white paper that was saying, excuse me, that maybe 450 parts per million is too much, even though that's the center of the current policy discourse. Maybe we should aim for 350. That was apparently appealing to McKibben because 450 at the time was in the future a few decades, and 350 we already passed. So if you're an advocate and you're saying we're already past the threshold of disaster, destruction, doom, whatever it happens to be, that creates a much more of a political imperative than, oh, we got to watch out for this target that we're going to hit in 2040 or 2050. He named his organization 350.org, and at the probably the inconvenient time of that the world was moving to temperature targets. So I mean, if he was doing it today, maybe he'd name it 1.5 degrees.org or something like that.
Sure.
450 was always associated with 2 degrees, and 350 has been associated with 1.5, but it's not as hard and fast as that. There's a huge amount of play and uncertainty there. But the reality is that the policy community leading up to Paris in 2015 and the big Paris Agreement kind of went full on, focused on the 2-degree target. And what are we talking, like, 23 years after Rio, they finally decided what dangerous anthropogenic interference was. And then as kind of a political carrot to small island states and other countries, they put some text in there that said there would be an aspirational target of 1.5 degrees. And that's kind of the modern creation of the 2-degree and 1.5 degree targets. After that, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the organization that is under the Rio Convention and operates the annual big climate confab, the COPs, every year. They asked the IPCC to do a special report on 1.5 degrees. And that's where we get to a fork in the road. The scientific community had never really up to that point studied 1.5 degree temperature outcomes, because the assessment of the community was, these aren't plausible. We're not going there. We're gonna blow through that in no time. And the scientific community had a choice. And when I say scientific community, it's a general statement. And leaders of the scientific community, leaders of the IPCC, individual scientists who chose not to or to speak out. It's a big bucket. But the scientific community decided to go along with the 1.5 degree notion, and the IPCC fell in line behind it, even though at the time, and still today, my personal assessment is that most people with expertise in this field don't think that limiting global average temperature change to 1.5 degrees, and we can talk about that in terms of what it implies for carbon emissions and fossil fuel consumption and energy, but it's just not going to happen. And so, the argument I made in my recent piece was that we've been kind of, I don't know, in a cul-de-sac, I guess, if we're, back to the map metaphor, if we're trying to get somewhere, with all this focus on 1.5 degrees. And we can talk about what that effects that has had on the modeling and the policy communities. But the general sense now is that we're going to pass through it, even if that's not broadly accepted. But what that means is that we're going to have to reopen up discussion of targets and timetables. And the question is, if it's not 1.5 degrees, then what are we doing here? What does success look like?
What do we? No, I think that's great. Like this is something I've been thinking about. There are like two wolves inside me, right? And there's a side of me that's like, believes in science is such a stupid phrase, I think. But
Right.
I'm convinced by scientific arguments that are well reasoned to the extent that I can understand them beyond a certain threshold of expertise, right? Like that's, and I think that they should be part of how we make certain decisions in the world,
Right.
especially energy decisions. That's why I like
Yep.
nuclear. I have a show called Nuclear Barbarians,
Right.
And there's this other part of me that is the, sort of like ancient philosophy guy that's very skeptical about the types of claims science can make in political discourse and how it should be evolved. And I think that this is perhaps a really good metric for this. And here's what I think. You can tell me. I'm going to say something, and then you can critique it and respond.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Good.
Yeah. I'm going to say what I see happen is that there is this idea that science gets to be both neutral and political as a way to Trojan horse political ends into it, right? So we say it's just what the science says, and so this is what we have to do. And I think that's a violation of what science is supposed to be. And that doesn't mean that I think that like nothing is settled, right? It's sort of like the radical relativism argument
Right.
is something that I don't believe in. But I think that that is an end run around the difficult thing you just described, which is we're actually going to have a very fraught conflict over what we're supposed to be doing.
Right.
And things like these models, like 1.5C, are a way to smooth over that and to basically hand it over to what I see as like necessary but misused instrumental bureaucracies. So that was long. I'm sorry. That's sort of my concern here.
There's a lot that makes sense to me. I mean, I will say that, the two wolves you described, I mean, science is only science because we're skeptical about science.
Right.
And science only stands up because it survives challenges. And so if we anoint, scientists or, people like me with a PhD as like a priesthood, and they can't be challenged for politics or, authority or whatever, then it stops being science. So I'm very much of the school of thought that the science behind climate change and its risks and energy policy and its opportunities and risks is plenty strong enough to stand up to all sorts of challenges. But for whatever reason, as this issue has become, globally politically significant, it has become more and more difficult professionally, personally, and so on to actually have those discussions. There's a scholar at Cambridge named Mike Hume, a longtime colleague of mine, who argues that there are some 2-degree futures that we can envision that are better off for people on the planet than other 1.5-degree futures. And basically what he's saying is you cannot use global temperature targets as a proxy for human flourishing or environmental flourishing.
Right.
And I mean, imagine a world that's 2 degrees, but everyone in the world has an average income of 200,000 US dollars. And then imagine a world of 1.5 degrees and everyone has an average income of 2,000 US dollars. You could probably say, well, the higher temperature one might have a little bit more climate change, but everybody's better off. And maybe that means the environment will be better off too, because there's a good correlation between those. So that's where it gets complicated, is when we reduce things to simple linear metrics, we lose all the nuance of the real world, which is, that's science too. So.
Right. So let me ask you this, as somebody who has been living in this world for a long time. You said something very fascinating to me. You said, like, personally, professionally, it's become difficult to have those conversations. What do you mean by that, and why?
So I'll give you an example. So I don't know, it's not too long ago, I was invited to write an op-ed for a major newspaper, Wall Street Journal, and it was something to do with disasters and climate change. And, I think it was on adaptation. And I had in there a statement that said, there's been no increase in U.S. hurricane landfalls since 1900. That's what the data says. It's a simple metric. You just count up the storms. And the editor took it out. And I said, why'd you take that out? And the editor responded to me that I know it's accurate, but all of our readers won't believe it because of the narrative around climate change and hurricanes and all that. And for me, that's and it was taken out. My piece, went out. And it was, it did fine. But if we can't say things that are true and supported by the evidence because we're worried that the mob, our customers, people in our political party won't like it, then we've kind of turned things on their head, and we've made it difficult for evidence and science to enter our political discourse. If someone doesn't want to believe that hurricanes have not increased, that's fine. They can think whatever they want to think. But if I can't say that because people are afraid of how they might react, then we have put some obstacles. Now take that little dynamic, that little story I just described, and then expand it into peer-reviewed literature or the scientific publishing, where we start governing or gatekeeping what can be said in science. And I've seen the same thing happen. I've seen editors of peer-reviewed scientific journals asking me to remove statements that are true because they're worried of the what will happen to them, the pressure and so on. So if we allow the external environment where science operates, which, science is absolutely essential in making good decisions, but if we turn that on its head, then we shouldn't be surprised if we make some bad decisions or go down some flawed pathways. We wouldn't do that when we try to fly airplanes or operate nuclear power plants or shoot down balloons in the sky. We probably shouldn't do it in other areas of policy.
I'm reminded, one of my favorite Platonic dialogues is the Mino. I don't know if you're familiar. It's great. This opens with a question from Mino to Socrates. Socrates, can you tell me, how can virtue be taught? Or, is it achieved by some other way? We could spend like a whole hour discussing what it meant is by some other way and why that's a weird question to ask, right? But Socrates, of course, has like a sort of condescending and very funny, ironic response where, he says, I'm but a humble Athenian. And if you asked any of my countrymen, we would reply, you're already ahead of us because you seem to know what virtue is.
Right.
Before you can get to taught. So they have this whole conversation where dialectically it's revealed Mino doesn't actually have a solid definition of what virtue is. And then he says something very fascinating to me, right? He says, Socrates, you have torpedo fished me. In other words, you've brought me to a state of aporia, of like radical uncertainty.
Right.
And now I'm kind of uncomfortable and a little bit scared.
Yeah.
I can no longer answer your questions. And I think what's been fascinating to me, I think this has been a trend really in American politics since the oil shock of 1973, is this entrenchment of crisis to avoid the feeling of aporia.
Right.
And I see that in many domains of intellectual life, not just the sciences.
Right. Yeah, this is very similar to what John Dewey, the American pragmatist, says, that when we're thinking, learning how to think and being a good thinker requires being willing to persist in a state of uncertainty or even ignorance for a long time. And there are issues like, how do we get to net zero carbon dioxide? And the answer, the only right answer to that is we don't really know right now. That's a big job. We know how to start the job, and we might be able to envision how we start moving in that direction. But do we know what we're going to do about jet fuel? Do we know what we're going to do about the petrochemical industry? Not yet. But we don't have, this is similar if you said 100 years ago to agriculture experts, how are you going to feed a world of 9 billion people? And the answer would be, the only honest answer at the time was, hell if I know. But we know how to get started, and we can move in that direction. Same thing with, advancing human lifespans. It's Steve Johnson has a book, he talks about, the doubling of human lifespans. If you went back a century and asked medical experts, how are you going to double human lifespans on planet Earth? They'd say,
No, like the only people that were even close to talking about that were like the weird subset of Soviets in the 20s and 30s called the Cosmists, who were like, we will conquer death. Like through
right,
communism, we'll
right.
bring people back to life. Like we'll
Yeah,
figure
yeah,
it out.
yeah.
But it's not like they had a roadmap for that. It was just
Right,
profoundly aspirational, you know?
right. But this is how policy works, especially related to technology, is that um, climate change policy, which is by definition very long term, decadal, better part of the century sort of a policy. Instead of focusing like how do we get rid of the last ton of carbon dioxide, our focus should be on, all right, how do we accelerate the progress that we're already making? How do we make
Mm,
tomorrow and next year we're moving faster in the direction we want to go? And then we'll reevaluate at that point. What have technological advancements? What have changes in policy and politics have enabled for us to do? So I think persisting with with uncertainty and even ignorance in this policy space is an okay place to be. It's fine. It's the normal state of affairs. But a lot of
mm.
folks find it uncomfortable for reasons you described, because it's you're unmoored, untethered from certainty.
Well, and it asks for something really interesting. It asks for something that I think is very, very recent in human life. And I've almost thought of this as a human habit, right? I've been thinking a lot about the fall of the Holy Roman Empire.
Yep.
The whole very, very early modern art of prognostication, like before it becomes the sort of the instrumentalized science that we have now, sort of in the
Right.
post-Newtonian, post-Baconian world, was about when does the apocalypse come, when the empire falls. And that was
Right.
the first gesture towards guesses in the future like that. And it was and before that, we had the idea of sort of like the cycles of history, you know,
Yep.
the
Yep.
rise and the fall and the decadence, beginning with a great flood, all
Right.
of these things, right? And we have, I think this is the same instinct that is for the stylized data. Like
Yep.
we want to understand when this sort of perhaps endpoint is, and then what we can do to perhaps avoid it. And so we need almost this enclosure around the horizon of the future to figure out what to do. And the evocation of a climate crisis is one way to do that. It satisfies a very human need. Saying it's okay to operate in the dark for a little
Yep.
bit is to ask for, I think, a profound, like a radical act of faith in the ongoingness of not just human life, but modernity, which has been unlike any other human epoch before it in very fundamental ways.
Yeah. I mean, that all strikes home with me. I mean, and I think, this is your area of expertise, but in energy, the debates over whether, the world should aim towards cheap, plentiful, accessible energy for everyone,
Right.
has persisted since, the 1950s, 1960s, starting with the population crisis. I put that in air quotes,
Sure.
going
Yeah.
now through climate change.
Mhm.
And there is a branch, I won't say it's the whole thing, but a branch of modern environmentalism that is very apocalyptic in kind of a secular manner, that views things like extreme weather as either portents or punishment for our sins, which are
Mhm.
the sin of consuming energy and emitting fossil fuels. Um, and turning energy policy from a morality play into a cold technical exercise of how do we deliver electrons to people who
Yeah,
don't have them.
right. Yeah. It's far less
I've come
romantic too, by the way.
right.
Like that's the other thing. It's sort of like it's almost like an American pragmatic response to the question
Yeah.
of meaning. And it's
Right.
understandable why people find that insufficient, by the way.
Right. 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 And I've
Right?
only
Like
come
at
to
an emotional
appreciate
level,
that.
we can sort of
Yeah.
admit that.
Yeah. No, I've only come to appreciate that later because, it is very easy as a policy analyst to be somewhat technocratic, but, recognizing that when people see energy technologies, they don't see a fork and a knife and a spoon, just an
Mhm,
implement.
mhm,
They map onto those technologies values, aspirations, even quasi-religious kind of feelings towards them.
mhm.
This better than me, but nuclear power is at the center of that kind of
Oh
discussion.
yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, it's the sword and the plowshare.
Mhm.
It is I think those of us who support nuclear power in the way that I do, it's not that we don't appreciate those of us that didn't live through the Cold
Yeah,
War
yeah,
have a very hard time understanding how almost ontologically significant the splitting of the atom was,
right,
both in its peril and its promise.
right.
Like unlike anything, it was so much more immediate than the onboarding of coal
Yeah,
into human life, which from 1712 on is like a very lengthy process,
right.
right?
Yeah,
It's not, oil, it was so that we already kind of got it. We were just like, oh yeah, it's like this other thing.
right.
The atom was something else. But and there are all sorts of questions of expertise and the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
relationship of science to the state with that and to the
Right,
military with
right.
that, all sorts of questions. So this is my sort of final question for you. And this is a big one, but I've wanted to ask you this. I think since I worked on the segment of Apocalypse Never
Yeah,
that you were featured in. So I'm glad I get to ask you now, which
yeah,
is what should the scientist's relationship with politics be?
yeah. So this is a great question. I wrote a
Yeah.
book called The Honest Broker in 2007, where I tried to map this out. And the answer is that there are multiple answers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and democracy needs expertise to function. At the same time, experts need to the phrase I use is make peace with democracy for democracy to
Mm.
function. And it's very contextual. So if there's an earthquake, like has recently happened in Turkey, and there's an emergency situation, you want governments and their experts making decisions right away. And there's not time for public input,
Mm-hmm.
and you just want to have the best experts there and available. If you're making a decision about the course of energy policy for the United States for the next 15 years, you want your experts to inform that, but it's not something that we have to decide today or tomorrow. We can have congressional hearings, we can have public
Mm-hmm.
comment periods. So the first thing to understand is that the roles of experts in democracies are multiple and varied, and not all experts have to do the same role at the same time. So
Mm.
climate change is a great example. We have scientists who are laying down in the street and gluing themselves to banks to advocate for change and protesting. We have scientists who are working with the IPCC to try to um, inform scientific assessments for policy. We have other scientists who are acting as advisors to congressional committees and congressional staff on legislation for their favorite political party. All of these roles are appropriate. And what I encourage my peers to do is to understand the different roles and when they're helpful and when they're not helpful. In the COVID, so I led a project during COVID on science advice in the pandemic, and I can point to numerous examples where experts self-organized and probably made things worse from the standpoint of policy outcomes than better, even though maybe their hearts were in the right place. But having dueling experts that cancel each other out and delegitimize the government, probably not a good thing. So this is the analogy I often use is marshaling scientific expertise in democracies is a lot like diplomacy.
Mm.
Diplomacy is an art, and it requires expertise, experience. We have schools of diplomacy that teach how you do it. We need schools of scientific advice for formal and informal scientific advisors, so people understand that this is every bit as important as diplomacy and every bit as nuanced and complicated. And there's no. It's like what's the best way to be a diplomat? Well, how much time do you have? Have a seat. It's the same
Mm.
thing with science advice. Is that it's an avocation, it's a profession, and we need to start treating it like that, because as we've seen in COVID and in energy policy and climate policy and public health issues more generally, we need experts, and we want to make sure they're helping the practice of democracy, not hurting it.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's if I could make a reading recommendation outside of all of the Roger Pielke Jr. stuff that's going to be in the show notes. I think people should check out, as I always recommend, rereading Plato's Republic. But there's a nice,
Yeah,
The Ring of Gyges is a really important passage in that, right? It's a guy who finds a ring that turns him invisible. And it's sort of a thought experiment about opacity and power.
Yeah.
And those things often go together, and you can't have radical transparency all the time. So what is this dance? This has been a difficulty of politics for a very, very long time. And I think as unique as modern life is, it behooves us to sit with our forebears to try to understand how they understood the problem.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the things that can help create the feeling of permanent crisis, which is also one of management and opacity, is a commitment to our terminal uniqueness.
Yeah.
Some things are different and some things are not. So on that note, everybody stay strong, stay sharp, and we will see you next time. Roger, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Emmett.